Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to part 9, the conclusion of the popular culture series. And I want to start with a brief consideration of the Media Free Week, which hopefully you had a chance to experiment with, and then sort of expand back out and set our current moment within a sort of socio-political history. So, if you tried to run the Media Free Week experiment, I'm sure what you discovered is what is both obvious but also, I think, somewhat disturbing. At least when I do this, I find it somewhat disturbing, is the degree to which the assumption that you will have access to this kind of technology is woven into the very fabric of getting through one's life today. So again, this is a technology that's barely over a decade old, only been around 10 years. I speculate that it's virtually impossible to travel now without access to a smartphone. They always want you to scan QR codes. They want to send you electronic tickets. They want you to present these tickets on your phone when you check in. Like, it's this whole process. Now, theoretically, you can do it without a smartphone, but they really want you to have it. Your friends expect to be able to call you or send you messages. You just repeatedly throughout your day, as I'm sure you discovered, that the expectation that you will have access to a smartphone is basically ubiquitous in our society. Similarly with work and computers, the notion that you might go to work and never use a computer or have to check a computer, is getting increasingly rare. Even I was watching someone do yard work. It was a landscape company. And so you're like, okay, here's somebody who's outside. They're doing landscaping. I was just out for a walk, and I thought, oh, okay, there is a job, because it's Media Free Week. I said, oh, there's a job you can do pretty much without access to any kind of technology. And then right as he was working, he stops, and he stood up, and he took his phone out, and he took a call, and then he got another phone out, and he started booking another client. And I thought, oh my gosh. So even someone who's doing landscape work is using not just one but two phones. Clearly one is the primary one for communication, and he's using another one for scheduling and bookkeeping, which made me think the second one was probably the company's phone or tablet, and that they use that to record hours and keep track of everything. So even our landscape guy who's outside cutting grass and doing his work is still interacting to a significant degree with the kinds of technologies that we've been talking about. And this doesn't make it evil. It's just to note the rate at which this technology has become absolutely interwoven into the very fabric of our lives. And the difficulty of this is, or the challenge, I would say, as far as popular culture and how it influences us, is that when we used to use tools, remember, these are just tools. If we used to use a shovel, stay with our landscape guy, our shovel was a shovel, and when we stuck it in the ground, we could dig with it, or we could get mad at our coworkers and pitch it at them, or whatever it was. Well, you can do a shovel with a lot of things, but it was a shovel. A phone, a smartphone, or a computer, or a tablet, these things are very malleable. But generally speaking, unless you have something that's highly prescribed, and we'll talk about that in a second, when you open your phone, you don't just see, oh, I have a call from a client. You also see, oh, I have a text message from my partner, and oh, new episode of the show I love just sent me an update, and oh, the phone wants to be updated, so I need to restart and update that. And so you don't control the message. You're not controlling what you're seeing in a lot of ways. The phone is going to tell you things whether you want to know them or not. And the more you interact with it and the more apps and stuff you get, the more of this comes at you continuously. And it's very difficult to control. I have an Android phone, and it updated and turned a lot of the things I had turned off back on. And so all of a sudden I was inundated with all this stuff that I hadn't been bothered by. And I'm like, oh, it resets some of the settings. You're like, okay, go back and do all this. So you're kind of in this relationship where you have to fight it all the time, and it's an ongoing battle. And so it's a device that has distraction built into it, as we were talking about last time. It's a device that undermines your capacity in some ways to focus, because it's always trying to get you to focus on other things. And it's not trying necessarily to help you focus on what you're interested in. It's trying to get you to focus on those things that the people who are paying for it, which you would think would be you, but often is not, want you to focus on. And so we're in this sort of endless struggle of distraction and co-optation and having our interests and desires sort of channeled and redirected at just almost every moment, just continuously as we go through our days. And because it's so ubiquitous, and because we're surrounded by it, we begin to forget this. We begin not to notice because we assume that this is normal, and it's actually utterly and completely atypical of the entire history of human civilization. It has only been within the last, I would say, 15 years, less than that, last decade, that this has been as powerful. So going just a little historical perspective, and there's enough people still alive who remember this. And so ask people, if you know them, who are old enough to remember the advent of TV. These people are passing because that's the generation that's going on. People are like 10, 11, 12, 13 or so when TV was finally starting to hit the neighborhoods. And I've had the same story repeated to me multiple times. And they said, one day we all played baseball outside. Baseball seemed to be the big sport back in the 1950s. And then one day, like half the kids were gone. We couldn't get a full baseball team together. And what had happened was TV landed. Some family in the neighborhood got a TV. And so 4, 5, 6, 7 kids were over there watching the new amazing TV. And some of the kids would watch for a while, and then they'd go outside and play baseball some more. But they said very quickly, just in the course of their own childhoods, from the time, again, they were 9, 10, 11, to the time, they're 12, 13, 14, depending on where they were in that range, it went from kids were just outside all the time, because what else are you going to do, looking for stuff to do. And so it was easy to get a baseball team together, or a stickball if you're in the city, or just, random piles of kids wandering around doing random stuff. To within a decade, the streets are 80% empty. Like just that many fewer children were outside doing their activities, and they had just moved inside because of the TV. And so this is a pretty significant transition of activity, particularly for young people. And this is sort of accelerated and ramified. And then when you got computers, interactive, all these kinds of activities now became even more drawn in, because when you basically interactive TV is one way to think of it, not the only way, of course. And so this gives even a further draw. And so people are inside their screens. The extraordinary thing about the smartphone, however, is it takes a lot of that interest and that attention and that focus and makes it portable, which is both great, like interesting tool, but it also means people are sort of inside watching TV everywhere they go, right? It has that kind of bizarre distraction effect. They're still not playing baseball, but they're not playing baseball outside with their smartphones, right? So is this a mix? Is this better? Is this worse? I don't know. But it is this continuous presence of the distraction machine. And as I mentioned earlier, in the last episode, the studies show that just having a phone present is actually in itself a distraction, because you often think about it or expect that you might be getting a call or getting a message, it might vibrate, something might be coming through. And so it has this sort of nagging quality, like a dog you haven't let out for a walk, right? Maybe you're not looking at it, you can't see it, but you know in the back of your mind that you should let your dog out for a walk, or you got to go out for a walk or whatever. It has this kind of built-in distraction. And this only matters, and now I turn back to the Media Free Week and the experiences that I've had with my students over the years, is it tends to mask all kinds of things. And so some of the most commonly reported occurrences when I would have my students do this and then report back, one is that they would tell their friends, like, oh, I'm in this class, I can't watch a movie, so let's do something else. And this would sort of like a binary opposition here. Sometimes their friends would say, look, we're going to go watch movies and eat popcorn, so if you can't come, too bad for you. And so that's sort of an interesting message, right? That participating in media and watching our movies and following our traditional pattern is more important than spending time with you as an individual. The other one that also came back is our friends would say, okay, let's do something else. And often what they would find out is that they had A, didn't know really what to do, and B, they got very awkward, right? They got very weird, And they realized that sometimes they just found each other boring. Sometimes they found they didn't really like each other. Sometimes they had a good time. That part of it was variable. But they said there was this phase where they all felt very awkward and uncomfortable because they realized that their pattern had been to, as I mentioned briefly, but this is an expansion on that, to watch a movie while having their phones on and being together and like eating popcorn or something, eating pizza, whatever they're doing. And so they were only nominally paying attention to each other. There was a presence there. They liked the presence there. We like to be with people, but they weren't really directly interacting. They weren't making a lot of eye contact. It was sort of a social lubricant, almost acting like an alcohol or a drug that makes you feel easier with people because you're not really paying attention to them. And then when they had to sit down and go, okay, we don't have all this technological mediation for our social relations. Wow, this is a bit awkward. This is a bit challenging. We don't know exactly what to do. We don't know how to behave. We feel dis-ease just being in the company of other people without some sort of, again, technological mediation. And that sense is profound, right? The notion that we struggle, or many people struggle to be with people if they do not have this heavy dose of technological mediation for distraction and to keep the attention away. This is somewhat disturbing, to say the least, because historically speaking, through the evolution of civilization, civilization has been around for for millennia, thousands of years. It has been focused on the interactions of people. To be civilized used to means in one sense to be the kind of person you can live with or live next to be in the presence of, to behave appropriately, to provide value in yourself, right? To entertain and to be entertaining. All these things were aspects of being a civilized person. And the notion that we find it awkward even to the point of being particularly strange and undermining to be just with people, to be in the presence of people. Of course, the pandemic just ran a huge experiment in this and made people feel, of course, terrible, because it turns out that when we're isolated from people and only can interact with them in limited ways and through technology, it's depressing. It undermines our mental health and our sense of our personal well-beings. Now, if there was any doubt before the pandemic, which there wasn't, by the way, we now know this. This is not a question anymore. Interacting with people through technology only, exclusively, is terrible for you. Like, it undermines your health. That you need to be with people in the flesh at least some of the time to feel good about yourself. This doesn't mean that any of this other stuff is bad in and of itself, by the way. However, we do know that if physical, personal, human interaction between people is undermined by the technology and that we can't deal with it without the mediation, this just undermines people's psychological and physical well-being. We just know this now. It's not even a question. Like I said, if it was a question, which it really wasn't before the pandemic, is not a question now. We know that this is absolutely true. And so it's like, how do we now learn to deploy these technologies, which are great? We can talk to people around the world. We can video conference. All these things are not evils in and of themselves. But when it becomes so ubiquitous in our society that we can't deal with people without it, now we're really getting to a space where this is unhealthy and unhelpful. And I think if you ran the Media Free Week experiment, it's pretty clear, not that you really need to run the experiment to see this, but it is pretty clear how unbelievably ubiquitous this is. Some of the heartbreaking stories that I had, and this unfortunately was quite consistent, is some of my students at the college we were, it was commuter campus, would still live at home. And so they would tell their parents or their siblings, like, oh, hey, like they're going to eat dinner and watch TV, which in a lot of American families is a standard approach to the world, unfortunately. Again, there's that mediation. We can't just eat and be with each other. We need the screen to mediate. And then, so they would say, hey, I'm doing this assignment for class. Can we turn the TV off? And a lot of times the students would report back that their parents would say no. So you can either leave, because we're going to do what we do, or you can just sit and watch the TV, right? These are your choices. But turning the TV off is not actually one of the alternatives that we will entertain. which is an extraordinary, when you just think about it, right? This is an extraordinary message, one, to send to your child, and two, about the depths to which the media has sort of inculcated us in the notion that it is necessary. These are people who feel that it is absolutely necessary. Other stories that I got consistently was that sometimes they would turn it off, and all of a sudden they said things got really great, that they really started enjoying themselves and having fun, and that they did a whole series of events for the week, played games, went for walks, did paintings, and like, wow, this is amazing, this is great. And I said, will you do it when the experiment's over? And they said, no, it won't. We'll stop. We'll go right back the way they did, right? Like, oh God. So even they could even articulate that they enjoyed this more, and that it was better, right? That they thought this was superior to the way they were living before, and yet it turns out not to be sustainable, right? We're just so used to it that we can't break that habit. And so, what I meant to do with this experiment, like the other experiments that we've been running, is simply to highlight this, to underline it, so that you can get a sense of it. In some ways, to denaturalize the society that you're in, which is it's a very steep intellectual challenge to try and do that. But once you start examining it in detail and focusing on elements that you may not have paid attention to before, it sort of raises the grain on your own society, so you can feel these patterns and then respond to them however you will. But for all of the negatives that I've been talking about, and what I do think is real threats to psychological well-being and education and all kinds of other things, it's important to remember, if we quote the great idea of it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Well, this is really just the best of times. And it's important in the larger historical context to remember what we're dealing with is this completely novel situation, which is billions of people, by far the majority of the world's population, has excess time, excess money and resources, and the freedom to deploy them to a certain degree. A certain amount of free time, a certain amount of free resources, a certain amount of freedom to be able to deploy them. This is just totally ahistorically unprecedented. Again, going back to 1800, 200-ish years ago, even 1850, by far, like 80% of the world's population was still subject to endemic hunger, which meant that you were going to experience periods of starvation and hunger in your life. And this was basically, even unless you were the super wealthy, most of the people in most of the world were exposed to sort of endemic hunger and starvation at some point periodically in their lives. Child mortality was high, literacy rates are low. Most people didn't deal with money, like money is not around that much. And so what's happened over the last 202 centuries is just this revolution. And the outcome of this revolution is the fact that we now have, again, billions of people who have excess money, excess time, and freedom to deploy them how they will. And in this unique, bizarre situation has rapidly grown this new thing, this new cultural system, again, called popular culture, because before, one of my favorite examples is sculptures from the Roman age, from the classical age of Rome. You can track them pretty precisely by hairstyles, because if the empress, particularly if the empress changed her hairstyle, all the other women in court would change their hairstyle. So all of a sudden, all the busts that were being carved of all the famous and important people, the hairstyle just changed, right? So popular culture was the culture of the 10, 20, 30 people that mattered in an empire, right? This was very top down. If you go back to ancient Athens in the West, we often look at this, you go, oh, okay, this was a city where maybe 10% of the people were actually active citizens in that democracy, and all the rest of the Greek world, the Hellenistic world, just thought the Athenians were mad and subject to chaos of democracy. They couldn't figure this out. Like, what are they doing over there? There should be a few noble families, an oligarchy, or there should be a tyrant, right? We understand that. But what are they doing letting, the great unwashed 10% of their population participate in governance? This makes no sense, right? They just thought this was madness. If you go to ancient China, which of course has perhaps the longest unbroken running civilization, the number of students who could take the tests to become a member of the scholarly elite was vanishingly small. We're talking a tiny percentage. And so while they had this amazing culture, it was restricted to just a few percent of the population at most, who had the free time to study the Chinese and study the Confucian classics to the level that would allow them to even take the test, much less pass it, and get a government position. And so if you got one of these positions, you were just immediately catapulted into the highest ranks of society. And you had the noble families still around, so they had a little court life was still existing. But we're talking maximum 5% of the population was involved in this. 95% didn't have the resources or the time to participate that greatly. And of course, there was a slope. There was some, spillover effects. China had early publishing culture. Buddhist texts are spreading. But this is a highly restrained society. The notion that the behaviors, interests, and appetites of 80% of your population would matter, and that they would be this amazing driving force in forming culture and cultural outlooks and cultural patterns this is not only absurd. For most of history, this was viewed as a threat, right? This is absolutely what you don't want to have happen. You don't want the unwashed, illiterate, uneducated masses to have any opportunity to change society, to inflect what's happening, to influence taste and habits and behaviors, because something awful and terrible will happen. And that sort of native elitism, by the way, still exists. So a lot of the critiques you'll hear today of contemporary culture come from this sort of, I think, vestigial sense of elitism, that, the wealthy, educated people know what's good, and what's wrong with our society is that either the middle class or the lower classes, or however you want to break these things up, they're wrecking the place because they don't have any taste. They have no insight. They have no appreciation of cultural greatness or these sorts of things. And I think this is all a bunch of nonsense, by the way. I think this is a very shallow and dead-end kind of critique. What's changed is that what used to be elite culture no longer has the heft that it did, because everyone gets to play now, which is all to the good. And that heft was always sort of, I think, to a certain degree, slightly illusory. They say, art used to really matter. And art did used to really matter because only the elites had the opportunity to participate in it. So by definition, the people who are participating are the people that matter. If you're looking at power and wealth and the chance to influence society. Well, now that everybody can play, it's impossible for it to have anything to have the same sort of influence, because it is by nature vastly more democratic. And sort of one of the ideas of democracy is that you're diffusing power. You're diffusing the locuses of culture. And so, again, one of the critiques that you'll hear continuously is that our culture is fragmented, like we don't have a coherent, organized culture. There's no central message anymore, all this. And it's just true, but it's simply the flip side of letting lots of people do whatever the hell they want, right? If you let a lot of people do what they want, it turns out a lot of different things happen. You shouldn't expect a single movie or a single TV show or a single book to be super dominant, because that would suggest that there's restrictions, that people don't have choice, that they don't have the freedom to express themselves. What you want is a highly fragmented culture, because a highly fragmented culture means people are able to express themselves in a lot of different ways. So this is a desirable, not an undesirable outcome. However, we're just not used to it. It upsets everybody because people want this imaginary, illusory world of coherence. And if you go back in the United States, the most popular TV show that ever was, and probably ever will be, almost certainly ever will be, was the Carol Burnett Show. And at a time when there were only 3 channels, unless you lived in like New York City or LA, but for pretty much 90% of the country, there were only 3 television stations. And the television shows that were on opposite the Lucille Ball show had, the Lucille Ball show, I'm sorry, not the Carol Burnett Show, the Lucille Ball show. It was getting something like a 60 or 70% audience share, which meant if the TV was on, there was a 70% chance these people were watching the Lucille Ball show. And so this is an incredible, focused, limited, narrow culture. And whatever the merits of that show are or were, it is in no way expresses or represents the general desire of the population. It represented like, oh, this is a show that everybody I know is watching, and so I think I'll watch it too, and I might think it's good. I might even think it's great. But if I had a chance to watch 20 other shows, I might watch one of them. But I don't. I can only choose from 3. And so I'll choose this one. And so it had this extraordinary focus and extraordinary power. But this was not culturally representative. You see something again back when on the radio, the music that people heard on the radio, all of a sudden some of the Southern, this was the origins of the spread of black music and the origins of rock and roll, was that these big radio stations were built that had huge broadcasting power. And all of a sudden, people all over the country started to hear Southern black music, essentially, for the first time. And it blew their minds, absolutely blew their minds, because if you didn't live in an area with a large black population, you probably didn't have the opportunity to hear this music. It certainly wasn't widely disseminated in the culture. And then all of a sudden it was. Chuck Berry starts being played on the radio. Singles start to appear, and you can start hearing this music. And so not just the United States, but all over the world, with the advent of records and of more and more powerful radio broadcasts, people had the opportunity to hear this music, and they're like, oh, I like this music. I want more of this music. And then sort of the history of rock and roll grows out of that. And so these powerful forces come and influences come not from narrowing of cultural choice, not from saying, oh, we have an agreed upon dominant culture that everybody needs to follow, but from diversity, from the opportunity of expression. And so on one hand, by any historical standards, we have vastly more access to vastly more aspects of culture in every imaginable way. And it's great. I mean, wow, how fortunate are we to have these opportunities? And likely we have some extra time and some extra resources to pursue them. So lucky us, unbelievably lucky us. However, the downside of this, or concomitant with this, and this is not necessary, but it is true, that given all this diversity, given all this fragmentation, and given all this opportunity, it has come along with the opportunity by business and industry and tech companies and media companies to try to just maximize their profit based on this richness of availability. And so there is a titanic struggle on to control and channel and focus the activities of as many people as possible on as narrow a range of experiences, of medias, of musics, of film as possible. And so it's not a government force that's doing this. It's not a, insidious hand of some secret corporate cabal. It is the sort of logic of a free market system that is based on attracting attention of people who have resources. How do I do that? Well, what's evolved as the most efficient method is what we're living with. Is it good? No. Does it have lots of deleterious effects on us as humans? Yes. Is it striving for our best interests? Absolutely not. It is not in any way trying to help us. It's trying to exploit us and provide, like we've talked about, the most limited amount of content to maximize their profit. And yet, this does not change the notion that we still have so much more access to so much more than people ever have had in the history of mankind. And that's what I want to leave on. This, to me, is actually the core of the problem. So there's a great story by Jorge Luis Borges called The Library of Babylon, Library of Babel. And he hypothesized that it's this library that has every possible book. So it has every possible organization of every possible word in whatever language it is. We'll just say English or Spanish in Borges' case. So it's every possible organization of every possible word of Spanish. And so what you get is there's a book in the library someplace that has your biography in it, word for word perfect, of your entire life, because that is one possible organization of the words of Spanish. how do you find it? Because, of course, a library that contained this would be infinite. And so how do you find a book in an infinite library? Answer, you can't. And this is the problem with this library that Borges meditates on in yet another one of his absolutely brilliant short stories. And this, I think, is the analogous to the problem that we find ourselves in. One of the reasons I think like a Netflix is popular, and certainly this is reported with something like Costco, is actually we want our choices to be restricted. We feel overwhelmed by choice. One of the things shoppers report that they like about Costco is that there is a limited selection. There's only one or two, maybe three things to choose from of any given type. And so it's easy to make a choice. And you kind of assume that they'll all be, reasonably good. So you feel good. If you're presented with a catalog of 100,000 movies, how do I make a choice? This puts a responsibility on me. And if I mess up, well, that's me. I picked a bad movie. I certainly could have picked a good movie. But instead I picked a bad movie. Bad on me because I have 100,000 to choose from. And so what media companies have discovered in the patterns that people project on them or respond to is we actually like having our choices restricted. We don't want the responsibility of having to decide. We want to feel good about our choices, and part of feeling good about our choices is not being forced to choose from too many things, particularly when we don't know a lot about a lot of them. And so there is this natural sort of human inclination to want to give over some of this choice, to feel overwhelmed. And so I'll abrogate some of my personal responsibility, authority, and power because I'm just tired. I'm too tired from all the other stuff I've been doing to have to select from 100,000 different movie titles. And I'll give you a perfect example. The Port Townsend, where I was from, has a lovely bookstore, William James Bookstore, incredible used bookstore. If you're ever in town, I recommend it absolutely highly. And they have a great selection, but it's small. So in the history section, maybe there's 1,000 different titles. And that's broken into European history, American history. And so it's sort of perusable. And then I was in Powell's bookstore in Portland, which is a huge used bookstore. They have new books as well. And the history section is practically a floor of a building. There must be 20 or 30,000 titles. And there's so many titles that it's just overwhelming. You don't even know where to start thinking about where to start looking, right? And so how we interact with and how we start to access the kinds of material, media, entertainments, enlightenment, education that we might want is a challenge that we really have never been prepared for. Nothing in my education prepared me for it. I think that's the first generation now that's being raised with this as an absolute clear and present difficulty. And so media companies profit hugely because they're helping us, quote unquote, solve this problem, of course, to their own benefit. But rather than be inundated with this infinite selection, we want to be inundated with a limited selection that we feel good about. And then if we don't know what else to do, we'll just we'll watch a movie we've already watched. We'll listen to a song we've already heard. Why? Because there is a slight risk of listening or seeing something new. I'll read a book I've already read or from an author I know about. And so these patterns become very limited given the infinite possibilities in which we're surrounded. And so we need to think about for ourselves, what am I trying to accomplish? What would I like to do? How would I like to feel? What kinds of ideas do I want in my mind? How many ideas do I want in my mind? And then interact with the incredible richness of the culture that we have access to based on that. Because if we don't come up with some sort of structural mechanism of our own creation for interacting with a society that is so choice rich, we will by default allow algorithms and companies to make these decisions, which, is in some ways fine, like whatever. But in other ways, what it means is that they're doing it for them and not for you. And so that this may be at the cost of your health. This may be at the cost of your psychological well-being. This may be at the cost of the quality of how you feel about yourself and your life. And so rather than aiding it or enriching it, it may be an active undermining of it. And so trying to come up with a way of thinking about this, I think, is vital for this new world that we find ourselves in. And again, a decade is, in the history of civilization, no time at all. There's a lot of evidence, just to give you some context, that the Reformation was in large part the product of the expansion of print culture. That the war, the ongoing, just massive socio-political, economic, military upheaval that reshaped Europe, and in some ways we still live in the history of the Reformation, was because of this new technology of print. And it took 100 years at least, maybe we're still absorbing, but at least 100 years, maybe 200 years, to begin to absorb the impact of literacy and print culture on socio-political issues and structures. So having something like internet technology for maybe 20 years, maybe 30 years, right? Like it's been sort of ubiquitous, but not more than that. And then smartphone technology for just over a decade, this is just brand new. This is totally new. And it's going to take a while to actually begin to absorb and respond to it in productive and healthful ways, because they are transformative. They do have huge impacts. So just as a thought experiment, as a way to begin to think about addressing this, I'd like you can ask yourselves a few questions and then see what the responses are, and then do whatever the hell you want based on those. But one question to ask yourself is, how do I want to feel? And I think this is asked too little. So different media, different content, different things, influences make us feel differently. And so I was thinking about this because I started to reread, this was a while ago, maybe a year ago, I started to reread Crime and Punishment and the Brothers Karamazov, the two great Dostoevsky novels, or two of his great novels. And I stopped reading both of them. I started Crime and Punishment, and I stopped, and I started Brothers Karamazov, and I stopped, and I was like, I really want to read about healthy people, not about unhealthy people. And Dostoevsky really has a magic art of presenting, I'd say, interesting, spectacular, challenging, but not necessarily super healthy people. And so I thought, I don't think I want that. I want something else in my mind. And so really just to ponder, like, what is it that I want in my mind? And how do I want what's in my mind to make me feel? How do I want it to impact and influence me? And if you start from a question like this, it's pretty interesting, at least to me, maybe not to anybody else, but at least to me, that it has a very different shape, has a different tendency to shape how I interact with the world, and what kind of media I look for, what kind of books I look for, what kind of music I want to listen to. And so sometimes I want, I say, I really want to settle my mind. I really want to feel in myself, to feel more free, as it were, in my own mind. And the two things that really work for me to do this are North Indian classical music and a lot of, not all classical music, but a lot of classical music, where Beethoven string quartet just sort of quiets my mind and takes me away for a time. Like one thing, I listen to all kinds of music, and so I'm not opposed to anything, but I find pop music that comes in 3 or 4 or 5 minute little snippets off-putting, because there's this constant change. Okay, now there's a new song, now there's a new song, now there's a new song. And so it disrupts my pattern, it disrupts my thinking. So I tend to like things that take me away or take me where I want to be for 30 or 40 or 50 minutes at a time, not for 3 or 4 or 5. Again, not there's anything wrong with 3 or 4 or 5 minute songs. Sometimes that's great too. And then say, okay, what kind of media will help me do that? If it's a movie, say, okay, I want to watch a movie. Do you really want to watch a movie, right? Do I want to turn off everything else, get rid of all my distractions, just sit quietly with a friend or two, or go to the theater? Do I want to have a conversation? Do I want to be in an environment where I can have a conversation, which means all kinds of things have to happen? Do I want to have a quiet time or I can just relax and maybe play chess or do something else like this. So, asking those questions and then seeking and then staging and then scheduling creates a very different landscape, because again, then you're choosing rather than having the choices thrust upon you. And so it's just a simple way of pondering and beginning to ask the question. This is no way obviously comprehensive. I just think it's a simple experiment to leave you with, to say, what kinds of things do I want in my mind, and how do I want those things to make me feel, and how do I want to be interacting with them? Because different movies, different medias, different delivery systems, all these different technologies really do impact us in profound ways. And I think we reflect on them far too little. And as I mentioned, far too often the reflection is like, popular culture is crap, people are idiots, all this sort of nonsense elitist critique. Or, if we had just a unified culture when everybody knew what was great and the great books and we all agreed about it, then it was great. This is also nonsense. This is just a type of totalitarianism. But rather saying, we're in this rare, spectacular, historically unprecedented environment of so much richness that we don't know how to choose. And so to stop and go, okay, what I need to do is decide what I like, what makes me feel good, how I want to experiment and try new things, and how do I then reach out and experience that. And I think if we start doing that systematically and with some care and self-reflection, then these opportunities can turn from distractions and things that often make us feel undermined and unhealthy into systems that we go, wow, I'm really fortunate to live in a world where I can just find lots of recordings by Ustad Ali Akbar Khan and listen to my heart's content. Or I can order some obscure novel that 20 years ago you couldn't get anywhere unless you were in a major city. I can order it from Amazon or Abe's Books or someplace else, and I can have it at my doorstep in a couple of days. I mean, these are miracles to live in a world like that. But there is a cost and there is a danger. So again, best of times, worst of times, mostly 100% the best of times. But I just think we haven't evolved good habits yet, if you want to think about that, for dealing with this absolutely miraculous world that we find ourselves in. So, popular culture, thanks for going on this journey with me. I hope you found it enlightening.